Corporate fraud works best in the shadows, behind corporate walls. How does the government bring these wrongdoers to justice? Whistleblowers. These are the stories of those who risk their careers to shine a light on allegations of fraud. Today on Fraud in America.
On this episode of Fraud in America, we spend time with Professor Kelly Richmond Pope of DePaul University. She's an accounting professor. She's also a best-selling author of the book Fool Me Once, which we will discuss in today's episode. She's also a director and producer of documentary films, including All the Queen's Horses, which was shown at 13 international film festivals around the world. We go into great detail about several fraud stories that have populated the newspapers in recent years, including the largest municipal fraud of all time. That happens on today's episode, but first, a special thank you to the whistleblower law firm of Getnick & Getnick for making this show possible. And now, today's episode of Fraud in America. Well, Kelly, welcome to today's show of Fraud in America.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. I love the title, so I'm really looking forward to this.
Amen. I have to tell you, Kelly, I think we are cut from the same cloth. And reading your book and then diving into all of your history, we have a lot in common. So I was really looking forward to today's talk. So before I forget, on the front end, I want to make sure everybody presses pause, heads over to Amazon, and buys this book, Fool Me Once, subtitled Scams, Stories, and Secrets from the $1 Trillion Fraud Industry. And if you're at a bookstore, you can't miss it. This bright green cover. I really love it. So Kelly, it's really interesting looking into your story. We talked to a lot of professors. Matter of fact, we talked to a professor last week from Wharton who talked about accounting fraud. And it's interesting because, a lot of professors, they talk in their ivory towers and they write articles that are hard to understand, and other professors read them. But looking at all the stuff you've done, right, writing a mainstream book, putting out a documentary, I saw that you did a course for outlier.org, trying to understand accounting using fraud cases. Why is it so important for you to educate the general public about fraud?
Great question. I think that my colleagues in academia do a great job talking to each other. But if we're going to really educate people, if we're true educators, I think the skill is taking a complex subject and making it digestible and understandable to the masses. That's the skill. So for me to use 6-syllable words and quote generally accepted accounting principles or generally accepted auditing standards, great. But I need to be able to share something with people that people can relate to and that people are open to thinking about. And so I think that's the skill that an educator needs to have. I think what was very impactful for me in my early days of being a professor was when I had volunteered in my kids' classrooms when they were younger. So the best training ground is observing a kindergarten teacher or a first grade teacher and seeing how they keep the young minds entertained, but also seeing how they can break down complex subjects into nuggets that excite people. And so Mr. Vaccaro was my son's kindergarten teacher, and I never will forget how he just moved and managed those 25 5 and 6-year-olds. And so I picked up a lot of tips on how to present, how to speak, how to write, so that people could relate to whatever the message you were trying to get out. They could relate to it.
Right. Yeah, I remember speaking to my daughter's, I think it was a first grade class, and, trying to explain what we do, representing whistleblowers and fraud cases. Finally, I'm like, wait a second, who watches Dora the Explorer? Anybody know Swiper? Swiper Stop Swiping?
Of course.
We go after Swiper, right? So, you see the light bulbs turn on. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What an impact, thinking in your own story, I immediately gravitated to your father's story. You mentioned that he was a chancellor at North Carolina Central University, if I remember this right. And
That's right.
something happened to
Go
him that
Eagles.
really, yeah. But like what you saw happen to him kind of set the trajectory of your career, if I'm understanding this right.
Well, yeah. And what happened is my dad believed in due process. And so there was an employee that allegedly had done something wrong, but the investigation had not started. There had not been any evidence presented yet. So a verdict, if you will, had not been reached.
Yeah.
And he believed that that process should happen. And his desire to fight for justice just brought too much pressure and too much heat on him. And he was like, you know what? I'll just go back to the classroom because I am not going to um, forsake my own personal value and belief in justice and due
Wow.
process just because I think this person should be fired now. That's not how we follow a process. So when we set a process in place, we need to see it through. So just watching that and seeing how it impacted his professional life. You know, there were a lot of people that supported his decision, but there are a lot of people that didn't. And
Mm.
so that was one very important moment in my life. And then another important moment was seeing my neighbor go to prison for embezzlement. He was a bank executive. And then my grandmother, and this is something that I just thought about not too long ago as I was just uncovering my own personal fraud stories.
Yeah.
My grandmother was an entrepreneur, and my grandmother owned a liquor store in Indianapolis, Indiana. She owned Choice Brands.
Yeah.
And we used to go in the summer. Now, this probably sounds horrible, but we used to go in the summer and hang out at the liquor store, you know, because we're
Yeah.
kids and grandma's there. So we'd be in the back. I didn't know what I was when I was sitting on top of Jack Daniel boxes. I didn't know what it was, but I mean, there was liquor everywhere when we were young,
Yeah.
but it was my grandma's store. But my grandma's shop suffered from people stealing money, you know, just taking
Yeah.
cash out of the till, you know, and we didn't call it embezzlement. It was just like, you know, cousin such and such was here and now there's $150 missing. You know, it was just sort of casual. But, you know, you think about how frequently fraud is around you. And I think my good to society is allowing people to understand how prevalent fraud is just in their
Yeah.
everyday life. Not only how they are impacted by it, but sometimes we also commit it too. These little things that we do that we think
Mhm.
is just okay, but we do it too. So I wanted the way I grew up and just seeing just different adults behave badly had a
Yeah.
lot of impact on me.
I really appreciate you sharing your story. Your personal stories made this book really come alive, and you can't help but see yourself in the stories you told. Not just about yourself, but about
Oh, for sure.
even other people. So I let me go right to the storyline that seemed to flow throughout the whole book. You saw a newspaper article in 2012 about Dixon, Illinois, which, by the way, I knew was the hometown of Ronald Reagan. I have a bunch of Ronald Reagan books back here. I'm like, oh, this is about Ronald Reagan. It had nothing to do with Ronald Reagan, but it had to do with somebody working at the government in the municipal office taking a lot of money. Can you tell the story about Rita and how
Sure.
all this unfolded?
So, as much as it doesn't have to do with anything with President Reagan, it actually does because of his famous quote, trust but verify, you know?
Mm.
And so the fact that he said that and he was from there, you know, it sort of brought it home and linked it all
Boy,
together. But I did a story caught my eye in the Chicago Tribune one day, and it was about a city comptroller who embezzled $50 million, $53 million over a 20-year period in this really small town called Dixon, Illinois. And as I was reading this headline, I said to myself, where in the world is Dixon? You know,
right.
it's this small town, 16,000 people population. And this woman pretty much stole all the money for over 20 years and no one knew about it. And I was fascinated, not fascinated by the fact that she did it. I was fascinated by what was the environment that allowed her to think that she could do it. And that's
Mm.
really what the documentary, All the Queen's Horses, really focuses on. And so that story is throughout the book because one of the things that I noticed at the at this stage of the game, when you do a documentary, is your own personal experience is not in there, you know? So I wanted to use the book as an opportunity to talk about what I learned, what I witnessed going back and forth to Dixon. And then at the end of the book is, where is Rita now? So we'll save that. If you read it, you'll know where she is now. Well,
Yeah.
you sort of learn it at the beginning, but then you understand why at the end. But so the Dixon, Illinois fraud case is the story that goes throughout the book. And although the documentary did well, there's still a lot of people that don't know about the largest municipal fraud in U.S. history unless something happened today.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've studied this for the last 20 years. I had no clue about this story.
Oh,
And I
good.
profess to be a fraud expert. So this is
Well, you
fascinating.
still are. You still are, Jeb. Now, like, this is the question. Have you seen the documentary yet?
I did not. And I was hoping to watch it this weekend. I did not
Oh,
get a
good.
chance to. Yep.
It's 71 minutes of time that you will be glad you spent doing. It's a very educational, entertaining piece. So I strongly encourage you to watch it.
I will make sure I watch this before this comes out next Wednesday. So yeah, I look forward to that. So let's dive a little more into this story. So you talk about, I love how you do this. You outline, everyone tries to paint people with broad strokes, especially victims of crime and perpetrators of crime. And you do a great job of telling relatable, digestible stories that adds color and also highlights the differences amongst these different groups. So can we talk about the perpetrators, the different kinds of
Sure.
perpetrators that you've identified?
So a lot of my experience with understanding perpetrators comes from the classroom. And so we at DePaul invite a lot of offenders to come to class and share their stories. And so through the years, I have noticed not only my own feelings, but my students' feelings vary based on the perpetrator story that they're listening to. And what I realized is all perpetrators aren't the same. Now, yes, there are the Bernard Madoffs, the Andrew Fastows of Enron. Those people exist. They are called intentional perpetrators. And those are people that know a system and they know how to exploit a system. They know where all the internal control weaknesses are, and they're able to exploit them for their own personal gain. And so movies are made up of intentional perpetrators. That's what we're addicted to. That's what we love on Netflix. That's what we love to watch. But there's these other two categories that I wanted people to think about. And that is where you or I could find ourselves. Because the problem with the way we talk about fraud is I think we always talk about it from a this is them, never me kind of perspective.
Yes.
And so we need to talk about fraud from the perspective is this is us. And so how can I create a conversation that includes us in this narrative? So the other two categories that I want people to think about are the accidental perpetrator and the righteous perpetrator. And so those are the two categories where you may see yourself. You might see a story or you may find yourself in a situation that's very similar to them. So the accidental perpetrator is a people pleaser, a team player, follows the boss's orders. Your boss says, you know what? We just need to just sign right here. I'll explain it to you later. Don't worry about it. And you do it because you trust your boss. Or your CEO says, I need you to book this entry because, we're just trying to meet a certain earnings expectation. Just do it. We'll figure it out later. Just please, I just need you to sign off on this. Just do it for me. And you do it. You don't think about, is this fraudulent? You're just thinking, I'm just trying to keep the wheels moving because that's what my boss is asking of me. And I want to get a good evaluation. So I'm going to do it. That's your accidental perpetrator. Now, your righteous perpetrator is someone that uses their internal resources to help someone outside of their company. So that could be you are a bank executive and your friend has a struggling startup and they submitted the documents, their loan documents, and they don't have enough in sales. I'm just going to add a couple zeros. I'll fix it later. Don't worry. I have the last word, the last say, and I'm going to do it because I'm trying to help somebody. And I know that they will be able to repay this loan. I'm just going to do it. That's the righteous perpetrator. So I wanted to create this concept of this is us. This is
Yeah.
not just them. This is us. Any one of us could fall victim, especially to these other two categories. In the book, I talk about an example of myself potentially becoming an accidental perpetrator because I had purchased a handbag, and the bag came in the mail. I was super excited about it, and then the next day, another bag comes. I only bought one. What do I do? Do I keep it or do I send it back? Now, I surveyed a couple of people that I know. Like, girl, you keep that bag. Keep the money. It's not your fault they sent it to you. And that's right. It's not my fault that I got two. So what do? I have this decision. Do I take or do I tell? Now, I decided to tell. I did not take. I sent the bag back. But when I called the store, I realized they didn't even know that they had sent me a second bag. So I probably could have gotten away with it. And then what if I had made it a habit of doing these types of things? So that's how you can become an accidental perpetrator. So I wanted to use those types of examples because I wanted to speak to you, Jeb. I wanted you to think back, have I ever gotten too much change back? Have I ever gotten something that I didn't pay for? Have I ever been in the store and there was a case of water under the cart and I just didn't say anything and they didn't charge me? That's how it starts. Not saying you're going to be a convicted felon, but that's how it starts. So that was the point of creating the three total categories under perpetrator, because I think the intentional perpetrator, we are easily able to say, that's not me. I would never do that. I would never be like a Madoff. I would never have access to do something like that. But these other two categories, that's where you could see yourself.
Really touches on this idea of the fraud triangle that you talk about in the book, the opportunity, pressure, and the last one that rings so true for me is rationalization. You're talking to perpetrators and they're like, well, it made sense in the moment, or as you were saying, I had a boss telling me it was okay, so obviously I just assumed it was okay, although bells going off internally. Can you talk about that, the fraud triangle?
Yeah, I love the fraud triangle because I think it breaks down fraud in a very succinct way. What I wanted to do was really understand more about the rationalization component of the fraud triangle. And so that's where my categories, my archetypes fit into how people rationalize, because everyone doesn't rationalize for greed. And that's what I wanted people to understand. And I think that when you understand how people rationalize, that is what leads you to implementing the types of internal controls you need in your organization, whether it's whistleblower policies, internal whistleblower policies, whether it's sign off on certain expenses, whatever it may be. It's understanding more about how people can rationalize fraud. That's very interesting. I mean, that's very important. Excuse me. It's very important.
Yeah. So what was your goal in writing this book? It seems like you had multiple goals, but in identifying, like, by the way, guys, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Right? You've been warned. This could happen if you don't have proper controls put in place. Was that one of your goals in writing this book?
Yeah, that was one of my goals. But also a larger goal was anybody can defraud. Anybody can be. Again, this whole idea that is them. No, people, it's us. We all can think about it. We may not all go through it, but some of us do. Some of us are able to get away with things, and we're just sort of looking over our shoulder like, whoo, thank goodness nobody saw that. Now, I got away with it this time. I'll never do it again. And maybe you do it a second time. So I wanted the book to be relatable. I wanted you to read it and say, yeah, that's happened to me before. Or, yeah, I know someone that's done that. So what do I need to do? What are my triggers? What do I need to do so that doesn't happen again? So, and there were a couple of messages. That was the first one. The second message was concluding the All the Queen's Horses documentary, because Rita Crunwell was released from federal prison early. And so she originally was sentenced to 19 years and 7 months. And so when she was released a little after 8 years, I was like, whoa, okay, what message are we sending? So let me have something to say about that. So the book also, towards the end, speaks to answer any questions about what I think about how that ended up not only for the town of Dixon, but what it says just to the fraud community. And Jeb, you're a part of this community too. I'm sure just hearing that someone that was sentenced to 19 years and 7 months after embezzling $53.7 million only serves a little over 8 years, it's probably
Mhm.
very shocking to you. So,
Absolutely, for
so
sure.
what does that say? So the book sort of answers to my thoughts on what that says to the community.
Let's talk about that for a moment. So she served 8-ish years and is now, I guess we can ruin some of the surprise in your book, but she's back living in Dixon now at her brother's house around the 6,000 citizens that she defrauded. How does that play out? I mean, you had a showing of your film there, right?
I did.
Yeah.
I'm sure that there is some level of confusion, some
Hmm.
level of outrage. But what I do in that towards the end of the book, and it's okay, it's a sort of a spoiler alert, but you still got to go read it.
Amen.
What I talk about is I do an analysis towards the end of, was Rita properly sentenced? And so I talked to some experts in the sentencing guideline space, and what we found was she was actually over sentenced in comparison to people that were in a similar felony class for amount stolen and length of time of the theft. She was actually over sentenced. So, in comparison to others that she was sentenced with, the 8 years is almost justice served in comparison to her class. So that was an eye opener for me, because data speaks. I mean,
Yeah.
you can't refute what the data is telling you. And so when you look at and you see the data and you see this one outlier, that outlier being Rita, sentenced to the highest level and no one else was, then maybe justice has been served. I don't know. You'll have to decide that on your own. But that's what I talk about towards the end of the book.
So let's switch to my favorite subject, whistleblowers. So
Whistleblowers.
in the Dixon story, this came to light because of Kathy Swanson. Can you talk about her and why she's considered an accidental whistleblower?
Sure. So when I was doing the film, I knew that Rita probably would never do an interview, because why would she talk? But I also knew that once fraud happens, once you get past how much the person stole and how they lived, the next big question, and sometimes maybe the first question, is who discovered it? So talking to Kathy Swanson was very critical to putting the film together. And Kathy Swanson is considered an accidental whistleblower because she was just doing her job one day and stumbled upon these transactions these withdrawals that was coming out of the city account, and she's like, "What is this?" And she noticed that they were really high amounts, and she's like, I've never seen this account. I don't know what it is, but I'm suspicious. So she stumbled upon it. She wasn't one of these people that just suspicious of everyone. So she launches her own personal investigation. That's not who she was. So she stumbled upon what happened. So that's why she is the inspiration by this accidental whistleblower. Also, when people are accidental whistleblowers and they sort of stumble upon things, I I find that they are celebrated in a different way. The story of a whistleblower or the journey of a whistleblower often is not a positive one. They're often ostracized from their community, whether that's their professional or their personal community or both. Kathy never faced that. And so I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that she didn't have this personal vendetta against Rita. She just spoke out for something that she stumbled upon, and people can respect that because it's a very natural occurrence. So she never faced the backlash that I think a lot of traditional whistleblowers face. And when I say traditional, I created two additional categories, and that
Yeah.
is the noble whistleblower and the vigilante whistleblower. So vigilante whistleblower, let's start with that one first, because what I
Okay.
believe and argue is that's where the word snitch, rat, tattletale, those are vigilante whistleblowers. And I can tell you, most days I'm a self-proclaimed vigilante whistleblower. Because if I see something that seems wrong, I'm telling. I'm speaking up. I'm like, that's not right. You're not doing that. I will report it. And so a vigilante whistleblower is a person that may see an injustice. It might not have anything to do with them. They just know the law. They're the person. Just imagine the neighbor that's sitting in that front window watching everybody go by. So she sees the person that is littering, and she might call the village to say, this person littered, or this person didn't pick up behind their job, or this person has an outdated license plate tag, or they're driving too fast down the street and their kids playing on this street. Someone needs to put a speed bump here. That's the vigilante whistleblower. Now, they have a need. They're a little nosy at times, a little busybody sometimes, but we need them. The noble whistleblower is the person that is a part of a group, part of a team, and the team has decided to turn a blind eye to something that they notice that is wrong. But the noble whistleblower steps out and says, no, we're safety inspectors, and we know that we haven't done our job right. I'm going to say something. I'm going to report that. That's the noble. Now, the noble whistleblower and the vigilante face extreme backlash. They are the ones that get the heat from being a whistleblower in a completely different way than an accidental whistleblower. So those are the three categories under the whistleblower. And those whistleblower
It's very
categories.
interesting. You also have a last one, the crossover.
Crossovers.
Whistleblower. Yeah. So what's an example of a crossover?
So crossover is actually a general title that captures those that have crossed over from an intentional from the perpetrator status to a whistleblower status. And so crossovers are very important to law enforcement because they tend to have inside information and they are vital in cases. So when we were doing, when I came up with this category, I did some interviews with some lawyers that talked about the value that crossovers have in investigations because maybe they were a perpetrator or played a role in the scheme and now they're talking. They are the crossover. And so they may be, they typically are crossing over to more of a vigilante status because they are, they're trying to save themselves, but we're really talking about the value that they have to a fraud investigation. And they're very important.
Yeah, I think that's so true. Thinking about the best whistleblowers that I've worked with, a lot of times they were in the early stages, seeing something wasn't quite right. They were playing along, and then there came a point where it crossed a morality line for them, or there was concern about, wait a second, I could be personally criminally responsible for what's happening here. I need to step forward and do something, right?
Absolutely. I think about person that used to visit my class all the time was Weston Smith from the Health South fraud case. And that is him to the T, what you just described. That is Weston all day.
So there's so many stories in this book and we can't get to all of them, but the story about the Little League World Series coach who stepped forward as, I guess, a noble whistleblower, you would describe it. Can you tell that story?
Yeah. So, Chris Haynes is who you're talking about. And so this was, a couple years, more than a couple years, but there was a team in Chicago that won the Little League baseball championship. And so when they won the World Series for kids, I forgot the exact title, but the World Series for kids, we'll call it. And when everybody was celebrating the players that won, what came out was the kids lived in boundaries outside of the team territory. And so it's a rule, just like a lot of rules, like if you go to live in a certain neighborhood, you go to a certain school. So if you played on a certain team, you lived in a certain vicinity of boundaries that were established by this Little League group, which makes sense, right? So what Chris started to notice was that people were celebrating and congratulating kids saying, oh, he's from my neighborhood. He lives down the street. So proud of him. He represents our community well. And he was like, wait a minute. This is not the community of this team. Now, Chris spoke out. And when Chris spoke out, my goodness, people were so mad at him. And this is the question. Yes or no? Did they live outside the boundary? Yeah, they did. Did Chris's team lose to this team that won? Yes, he did. Was he upset that his team lost? Probably, but that's neither here nor there. Chris was saying the team rules state that you need to live within this vicinity. These players do not. This is a problem. And he spoke out. And my goodness, you would have thought that it was like another war in Chicago over that. But how wrong was he? You know, so he was this noble whistleblower that had something to say, you know. And so some people thought that he was just a poor loser, but really, like, are you? Like, it's almost like if you're in a classroom and you're taking an exam, and let's say you are you're wanting to get your real estate license. So I'm going to put it more in the adult space, not going back to college. Say you want to go, you decided you want to sell real estate, and you go and you sit for the real estate licensing exam, and you find out everybody in the room had the answers. Everyone was cheating but you. And say they all passed and you failed. And you failed because you didn't have the answers. Are you wrong for turning everybody in? Are you a sore loser because you didn't have the answers? Probably not. So like I wanted to create these points of tension in the reader's mind as to what would you really do, you know, if this were you. So that's the story of the baseball and the students and the kids.
And I love that you had your students debate this fact scenario, and unbeknownst to them, Chris was in the classroom, right? Am I getting the story right?
Yeah. You are getting it right.
So how'd that play out in the classroom once they discovered, wait a second, the person we're talking about is sitting in here in the room right now?
You know, they were torn. You know, half of the class felt like he was just a sore loser, and the other class felt like, no, I mean, these are the rules. Clearly nobody else was paying attention to the rules. He wasn't wrong. So it was about a 50-50 split in terms of the support for him. So it was a fun debate. And I think it forced the students to think, what would I do? You know, what would I do if I felt slighted because of the unethical decisions of others? Would I speak up or would I just deal with it? And if I did just deal with it, why am I just dealing with it? So in the classroom, I like to create those types of points of tension where you have to think about what you would do.
Let's go back to Durham. You grew up in Durham, North Carolina. You're somehow a North Carolina and a Duke basketball fan. I don't know how that's possible.
Yeah, I like both. Who's
you like
who's
both?
To say? Yeah, I like both. They're both great schools, great teams.
Well, I'm a Kentucky fan, so I'll let all this slide. So UNC a few years ago, I remember this really well, had an academic fraud scandal that broke. The whistleblower that came forward in that case, can you talk about her and why she decided to step forward?
Sure. So Mary Willingham is who you're speaking of. And so Mary Willingham was an academic advisor that helped student athletes excel in their courses and their schoolwork. And what she started to notice was students would come in and they would present work to her that seemed as though it was well above their comprehension and reading levels. And so she started questioning, like, wait a minute, like, did you really write this? And they're like, oh, no. There's a database of papers that we can just pull from to submit for a grade. And she's like, oh, no. This isn't right. Not only is it not right, you're robbing yourselves of the education that you're supposed to receive. And so she spoke up. She spoke out, and good grief. So you said you're a Kentucky fan. So just imagine someone saying something that could impact Kentucky sports. Even if they were right, do you really want them to say that? Now, Jeb, I'm asking you, do you really want them to say it's going to impact your recruiting class? It's going to impact the number of alumni that donate. It's going to impact everything about the athletic sports at Kentucky. What are you going to do, Jeb? Are you going to say something?
Yeah, I'm torn. That's right.
Yeah, you're torn, right? Because you love your team and you want to see your team excel, but is it okay to excel by any means necessary? Is that okay? And so Mary decided that it wasn't, and she spoke out. Now, being from the Raleigh-Durham area, the ACC sports, that's serious business. You know, you're talking about Duke and Chapel Hill. Arguably, Jay, you may disagree, but arguably, the largest college rivalry in the US, arguably, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
So you are having a person that is disrupting that. I mean, this is Dean Smith. This is Michael Jordan's home. I mean, just think about what UNC Tar Heel basketball, football, mostly basketball represents. So she's shaking that system. People were not happy. But she felt like this isn't right. This isn't right. We can't be robbing these students of an education just to run a ball up a court or on a field. So that's why she spoke out. She was very convicted. Now, what's interesting about Mary's journey is I believe that because she was a little bit more senior in her career, she could take the hit a little bit harder than, say, a younger person in their career. So that's something that in interviews with Mary, she always talked about that, I was closer to retirement than closer to recruitment, And so it was easier for me to fight. And I think you have to think about your place, not only in your professionally, but personally. What do you have the stamina for? And she had the stamina in her life to take the hit, and boy, did she take a hit, but she felt like it was the right thing to do.
That's really interesting. And thinking of all the whistleblowers I've met over the years, there's certain traits I've noticed. A lot of them tend to have a sense of faith or a sense of a bigger purpose beyond just their day to day. Certainly, the more senior management, if they're closer to retirement, they're more likely to become whistleblowers. I think
I think
probably
it's
true.
definitely fair. You think about your careers towards the end, you may have more savings. The likelihood of you going to work somewhere else because you're close to retirement is lower. So it's easier for you to fight for justice.
Absolutely. I also noticed that usually the first couple of weeks after the new year is when you'd see a huge uptick in people reaching out after a time of reflection.
Yeah,
I'm gonna start
the year. Yeah, I'm gonna start the year off clean and right with a
That's
clear
right.
conscience. Yeah.
Absolutely right. So I went through your list of red flag triggers that people should look for. The first one, never trust anyone who doesn't like dogs.
I mean,
That's fascinating.
Like, who doesn't like dogs? Now, listen,
Amen.
you might be scared of dogs. I can accept that, but who doesn't like a dog? You don't like dogs? I'm not fooling with you. Everybody's seen Benji, right? Come on. You don't like dogs. How could you not like dogs? Or Lassie. How could you not like a dog?
Yeah. So I recommend everybody read the book. You'll see all the red flag triggers. Make sure that the people who are in charge of your finances or checking your books like dogs. That's an important one to follow. So it was interesting to me. So Kathy Swanson uncovered this fraud happening at Dixon, ultimately $53 million stolen. The books were audited by a top 10 national accounting firm. They missed it. One gentleman in town, Gene, the town complainer, was raising some concerns. I guess people disregarded what he was saying. How does this happen in a town of, that has a budget of $6 million? $53 million is stolen. How does that happen?
Well, it's not just a Dixon thing. It's an every place, everywhere thing. We trust people. I was just reading an article today in the New Yorker, and you might have seen this about an author who it's about the novelist. Let me see if I can find it. Who lied about his entire life. I mean, he just fabricated his whole life. This famous author who recently died, and I can't find it right now, but it was in the New Yorker about someone who lied. And the question is, how do you live a lie? Like, Jeb, what if I just told you I received my bachelor's from Harvard, and then I went on to get my divinity degree from Yale Divinity School? Mm-hmm. Are you really going to call Harvard and Yale to double check what I said?
Good point.
No, you're just going to accept it. And then if I could even tell you some of my classmates or some names, you're like, oh yeah, they did go there. I think they graduated then. You're not going to check up on it. So it's our inherent need to trust people so that we can maintain social relationships in a healthy way. And I think that is why it happens. Rita was trusted. She was good at what she did. And it makes your job just a little easier if the person that you have to evaluate is really, really good. And if they're really, really good, it's less that you actually have to do. So that's why I think it can happen. So it's not just a Dixon issue, it's an everywhere issue.
Yeah. Hey, you mentioned that churches are especially vulnerable to fraud. Why is that?
Because I think churches operate off of volunteerism. And so you find that you have a lot of people that are overseeing very significant operations that could be volunteers are poorly trained in the role that they are overseeing. And so I think that that's what makes churches very vulnerable.
So, what is the big takeaway that you want everybody to take away from your book, your documentary, everything that you've uncovered over your career regarding
Yeah,
fraud?
it can happen. Fraud happens. Fraud happens
Mm,
every day for a reason. And fraud happens every day, but it's reported fewer and fewer. So one, I think we have to be real and honest that fraud can happen in any organization that you work in. But we also have to make sure that we are creating environments where people will come forward and tell you if they see something, because there are red flags all over the place in most of these cases that are in the book that happen in our lives, but we don't speak up, maybe because of fear, maybe because we haven't implemented the right processes for people to speak up. But fraud can happen. Do you have a proper way to report it so that everybody knows, so it can keep you safe, your organization safe, and keep everybody having a job? So that's really the message.
Well, Kelly, I want to acknowledge you for making this so relatable for people. I'm usually on a similar soapbox and telling people this could happen to you, or you're trying to tell the stories of whistleblowers so that they can see themselves in the story of the whistleblowers, so that it gives them a sense of courage to step forward and do the right thing. So I really appreciate the book. I appreciate the documentary. I appreciate everything that you've done to shine a light on a really important area.
Thank you so much for having me. And I love the podcast. I think it's so important. Fraud in America, it is here to stay. Maybe one day we'll see it reduce, but for now, we have to have these conversations and see ourselves in this fraud cycle, because we all play a role.
Absolutely. Well, until next episode of Fraud in America, if you see something, say something. And if that doesn't work, make sure you do something. If you believe you have witnessed fraud against the government or fraud on the financial markets, we encourage you to visit our website at taf.org, where you will find a directory of member attorneys who represent whistleblowers across the country. On our website, you will also find additional information about our nation's various whistleblower laws and programs, and a way to donate to our organization as we step forward in spreading information about whistleblower programs. This episode was edited and produced by Rachel Brooks, and our theme song is by Connor Chaos. A big thank you to our TAF staff and researchers of James King, Emma Bass, Jackie DeMar, Kate Scanlon, Max Boldman. Fraud in America is a project of Taxpayers Against Fraud Education Fund. The opinions expressed on today's show belong solely to the guest and are not necessarily endorsed by the organization. Thank you for joining us on today's episode of Fraud in America.